buenos días, compañeros. Estamos aquí en las reflexiones para vivir en el encierro, un espacio del Instituto Nacional de Formación Política. Hoy tendremos un evento, ahora sí que multinacional y bilingüe en muchos sentidos. Nos van a acompañar Cristian Hernández y Agustín González de la DSA de los Estados Unidos. Va a estar también con nosotros desde la Argentina el compañero Juan Grabois y va a moderar este evento nuestra compañera Donají Alba. Entonces, no se vayan a sacar de onda. A partir de ahorita vamos a hablar en inglés y vamos a ver todo con subtítulos en español, como en el cine viejito, ¿no? Entonces, voy a dar una introducción general y voy a plantear el marco general de este debate, ¿no? Y bueno, voy a empezar en inglés. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, since the 1980s and for the next decades, the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, Wall Street, and the Treasury Department of the United States promoted everywhere what we call the Washington Consensus. According to this project, the implementation of free trade policies would bring democracy and prosperity throughout the whole world. In order to implement this project, the welfare states were dismantled everywhere and all their social benefits were put aside. Everything was considered a merchandise, even water, even health. In such a world, there's no place for human rights. Nowadays, in 2020, the results of this economic policy is at plain view. Only the very rich have benefited from the Washington Consensus. In this system, everything is acceptable as long as it produces quick profits. Greed has become a value. Under the system of free trade, the suffering of millions of people are considered just collateral damage. What monetarism offers to the vast majority is an undesirable society where there's no place for the most basic human rights, liberty, equality, or solidarity. The free trade dictatorship is the antipode of the ideal society. It's the country of a utopia, it's a dystopia. Slavoj Žižek was right when he said that capitalism nowadays moves to a logic of apartheid, where a few have everything and the majority is excluded of almost everything. The model seems to be Gaza or Cisjordania. The arrival of the pandemia of coronavirus has put humanity in front of its worst sanitary crisis since 1918, when we lived what we called the Spanish flu. The sanitary emergency of coronavirus took most of the Western countries unaware and with a very low system of defenses. And that's because, and we have to make a story here. After the Second World War, in many latitudes, the welfare states achieved with great effort to build solid sanitary systems that covered most of the population. But in the neoliberal era, those health systems were dismantled because they really thought that medicine should be privatized. They were dismantled because they had the idea that health was a merchandise and not a right. What we are facing now is a major humanitarian crisis, and that crisis is originated basically because of this idea. I do believe that during the crisis, when crises happen, so societies tend to make important changes. The neoliberal oligarchy, who is the great responsible of this sanitary crisis, is trying to use this pandemic to make a series of political and economical readjustments. The free trade model is in a huge crisis, and the few people, the very fortunate few that benefit from monetarism, know that their window of opportunity to restructure their project is very narrow. They know it's now or never. And that is why in Chile, President Sebastián Piñera accompanied the instructions of confinement with a curfew. And that's why, while all the American people were, while COVID was spreading around in the United States, Donald Trump profited the occasion to start a great anti-narcotics operative in Venezuela against Nicolás Maduro. The problem is very serious. In full crisis, now in this sanitary crisis, the neoliberal right is willing to sacrifice people in order to save the market. They bet against humanity and for Wall Street. It's unhuman. They try to reposition themselves in order to reactivate slave labor and the saccage of natural resources all around the world. We are now facing a dilemma. Should we continue with the model, or should we try to start on new basis? I do believe that we should make a huge effort everywhere in order to impulse a project that puts people ahead and that puts profit behind. And I do believe that in this context that we have this talk, this multinational talk. And so this is all I wanted to say. And I leave you now with the microphone, Christian and Agustín. Thank you very much for being here.
Muchas gracias, Fis. For me, it's going to be also in Spanish first and then in English. Compañeros, primero en español, esta sesión será en inglés, pero primero quisiera decirles que esta transmisión es una colaboración entre el Instituto de Formación Política de Morena, la Democratic Socialists of America, de los compañeros Austin y Christian, y el Frente Patria Grande. Juan Grabois llegará en un momento. Empiezo en inglés también. Hi, everybody. We are so honored on this evening to have Juan Grabois, who is coming, and the members of the DSA, Christian Hernandez and Austin Gonzalez. This meeting represents for us a bridge with people from Argentina and the United States of America, but also between Morena and Frente Patria Grande, with people and also with people from the Democratic Socialists of America. Those whose lives, like our own, are impacted by the failures of neoliberalism and the injustice of inequality in all its forms. So let's start with the questions. Austin, I read something you said. You said that what I am is a worker. To quote the late Big Bill Highwood, I've never read Marx's Capital, but I've got the marks of a capital all over my body. So for a worker, as you are, what's the significance of the spontaneous organization of people, often without the focused support of political parties, labor unions, or other common affiliations against systematic racism and oppression? Is it possible to envision a future where people from a region, a continent, or even perhaps globally organize themselves for a common cause? Austin.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And of course, Thank you so much for your time. I thank all the folks from Morena, from the Institute, and our friends in Argentina as well. But getting to this question, because it is a very important question, I think this fact that you've touched upon in particular is highly significant. This fact that a lot of the people that have been in the streets have been there without the focused support of political parties or labor unions or common affiliations. I think this is an example of a couple things, a couple very important things. One, it's an example of how a lot of mainstream political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States, and as well as a lot of mainstream labor unions, were frankly out of touch with the moment that was unfolding. And I think this is also this lack of kind of focused participation, so to speak, is also an example of how there are so many people right now in the United States, often very, very young people. In my own town, small town in Virginia, the majority of protesters, they've appeared to be high school students, just high school kids. And these are kids that they want to go out and they want to make a difference. They may not be in any sort of common affiliation, but that's precisely because of how widespread the current protest movement has been. I myself, I've been to countless leftist rallies, countless socialist rallies, workers' rallies. I've held a lot of leftist rallies, right? But what I've been seeing in the streets these days, it is not just your average leftist rally. What I've seen in the streets is the community. It's the community that's coming out and voicing their anger at the systemic racism and depression in the United States, and more broadly speaking in the world, right? It's the community that's saying that they won't stand for this anymore. It is the community that knows something is wrong and that we are all running out of time to properly fix that. When I was growing up, there was a time, growing up in the United States, I should say, there was a time that a large segment of the population doubted the existence of systemic racism, or at least that was the narrative that people tried to present. I just look back to the Rodney King riots of the early 90s, countless other examples throughout the 20th century. The Watts riot is, of course, a big one as well. But now, things seem to be a little bit different. Our society is at a turning point. Our culture is at a turning point. People now have the ability to see everything with their own eyes due to the prevalence of social media and our globalized world, our globalized community, right? People can't deny the existence of systemic racism anymore. People know that they have to identify it and they have to address it head on if they want to fix it now. And that's what people want to do. They want to fix it now, right? People are tired of waiting. And I think that's a big part of how this has all happened. People nowadays, at least the people that are in the streets, they didn't necessarily need to be there because of a certain political party or a labor union to get involved. A lot of the young people, I should say. And the fact that they haven't is just a testament to how widespread this all is. Something I've certainly never seen in the United States in my entire time living here. And truly, it shows how everybody is waking up to the sad truths of systemic racism that pervades the United States and pervades many parts of the world today. And at the same time, I should say that I feel compelled to say that it's also our responsibility, in my opinion, it's our responsibility as members of more established leftist institutions to give a platform to these voices, to uplift these Black voices. In many cases, these are Black voices. These are young Black people. We must help guide these voices, right? We must introduce political education to these voices wherever possible. These young people right now, they know something is wrong. We don't have to tell them that. They know something is wrong and that they want to fix it. It's up to us to guide them in the right direction, to guide them in a socialist direction, right? At least here in the United States, right? Or else other groups undoubtedly will. Other groups will tap into this anger, and it's important for us to recognize that. And following up on the second part of the question, there also ties into why I mentioned the importance of social media, which, to be clear, talking about how we can create common cause either regionally or continentally or even globally. I think social media has been crucial to all of this, right? I'd say, or at least I guess it's commonly thought that, when we look back to Egypt during 2011, during their revolution, we think about how important of a role Twitter and Facebook played, right? It's the same thing here. It's the same thing. It's the same phenomenon. At least that's what it looks like to me. Social media has brought the truth to people's faces, as well as giving them an easy avenue to plan demonstrations. And I think this is further evidence that, yes, it is possible for people to be organizing themselves regionally or continentally for a common cause. Which is why I once again thank you all for having us here, because this is part of it, right? This is part of that dynamic. It's using platforms like this to bring us together and to recognize that all of us, we are not as different as our neoliberal elites, as Raphael was touching upon, as our neoliberal elites try and tell us we are, right? That we're all one people fighting for one common cause and one common goal together. And that this is something that we must do together. We live in a globalized world, a globalized economy. As long as we're fighting in isolated directions, the powerful, they'll always be able to play us off of each other. That's a big part of how Donald Trump became president, right? You playing Mexican and Central American migrants off of people in the United States. But when we make common cause as one continental people, in this example, that's when we can truly have the power to fight back against our regional elites. And I think this day and age, we are presented with such a unique opportunity to do just that. But I'll spare you my further thoughts on all that, because I could go on for very long. It's a very good question.
Thank you very much. Of course, we're the same. And of course, the social media, this broadcast is going to be on live on Facebook. That's one of the answers we needed to get together now. So the first question for Christian. I also read something you said, Christian. You said, let me see. You said, I joined DSA because I was tired of feeling hopeless and helpless, because I couldn't see the evils of capitalism and not organize. So I wanted to ask you, with spontaneous protest against racism and police violence happening all over the United States as well as around the world, is there sufficient momentum to realize significant and lasting improvements in racial inequality? Or is the mobilization and reduced engagement a threat to lasting positive change? Christine.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for having me. And yeah, I hope so. It's definitely within the realm of the possible for radical change to occur, as long as organizers as well as organizations, like Austin mentioned, are attuned and really have an ear to the ground in order to find what work needs to be, carried out in order for all of this to happen. I think there's a lot of righteous rage that's heating up in the streets. It's been weeks now, and I've honestly yet to see any signs of that slowing down. However, I do recognize that I'm a lot more connected to my community than I think a lot of people are. I think even more so now during a pandemic, there are definitely ways like social media that are keeping us connected, but a lot of that's relying on existing relationships. But I do hope that people take the time right now to really connect with each other, especially over social media. And so I see, the Instagram stories, I see the calls to action. I see people internalizing the urgency of this moment, because it is a very urgent moment. But the media, the mainstream media, I think has mostly moved on, because it's not fitting with their agenda. And I don't think that the media is interested in continuing to cover the uprising. So I do worry that the lack of media coverage will translate into many people thinking, especially in the US, thinking that efforts have fizzled out when they certainly haven't. And I think, which to me indicates that, new organizers, seasoned organizers, and organizations that are ready to take action really need to continue making this shift in political consciousness like very real to people. We have to make it inescapable. And there are some signs of that happening with the efforts to defund the police. Some of the anger that has translated into campaigns to take money away from cops and reallocate them into our communities. I've seen that rage put into political education, into talking about the merits of abolition, to explaining the racist history of policing, and to really highlight the ways that the police as an institution are drivers of social control in more worrying ways, such as the hyper-militarization of many of our police forces. I've seen the rage and the patience and diligence of people who are helping others understand why it's important to center Black liberation in this moment, and how a fight for Black liberation helps all of us. Solidarity is a hard lesson to learn and a never-ending process, and I'm glad to see that there's a lot more receptiveness to this idea of collective liberation than ever before. I've also seen this rage connected to the racial disparities of how COVID impacts Black and Brown communities especially, and the rage connected to the attempts to reopen schools in the fall, which is going to be disastrous if that moves forward. The Los Angeles Teachers Union, for instance, recently came up with a list of demands as to the conditions under which they'd agree to open schools. And those included defunding the police, passing Medicare for all, passing a wealth tax. And that's huge. It shows a commitment to connecting our struggles, to showcasing how these systems are interconnected, to highlight that racial capitalism means that there's not a coincidence that Black and Brown people are often hit the hardest by the pandemic and by policing, because the systems were designed to do so. And as was mentioned earlier, people are really coming into the realization that racism is systemic. It's not just individual. So I think as long as we continue to embrace the movement, continue to encourage people, disrupting in whatever ways they want to, and support people newly engaged by this uprising and channeling their rage to distinct and radical demand, we can really sustain a movement that will transform society. I don't disagree that there's always the possibility that people will move on or that people will become less militant. But that's where I think organizers and membership-based organizations really have an opportunity to encourage and support people that are being radicalized by the moment. And not to control the direction of the uprising, but rather to fan the flames, to fuel the fire in a way that makes it last. Because I do think we have to keep disrupting, we have to keep expanding, and we have to keep publicly naming the problems and the solutions, and demand nothing less. Sometimes I think the hardest part is getting people to believe not only that we deserve a better world, but that we already have the power to make it happen if we come together, especially on an international basis.
Great. Thank you, Christian. And it's really important to listen to you because you are really young and you are organizing yourselves in America. So, Juan, nice to have you here. Hola.
Sorry for the late.
No, let's start with an answer for a question for you. Juan, what do you think? Is it possible to envision a future where people can organize themselves for a common cause? I listened an interview of you, Juan, saying that this pandemic can be resumed in 4 verbs: to feed, to heal, to respect, and to take care. These verbs are strong enough to organize ourselves all over the world?
I think that we have like emergency issues and long-term issues. The first thing I think that we have to focus is in the systemic change, that this system is not working, that the pandemic, the ecological crisis, and the social economic crisis is part of the same crisis, and that is a crisis of capitalism. This may sound ideological, but I think it's the core of the problem, that we are able internationally to put in the center the main problem, which is the system in all its aspects. The links between capitalism and racism, patriarchy, pandemics, because I think the system is very capable of absorbing our struggles and changing that the core of our struggle. Then we have a slogan which we call housing. In Spanish is easier because it's tierra, techo y trabajo. Las tres T. In English is housing, work, and land. Maybe we don't have this play of electricity. And this is a very short slogan, but I think that it goes to the core of the problems. That this system can give us cell phones, technology, and so on, but we cannot have a decent job, we cannot have a piece of land, and we cannot have a proper housing, which is the international core of the alliance I think we have to build in social terms. The excluded in all its ways, the precariat, the workers that are in the most precarious situations, and what we call in Spanish, los indignados, the people that may not suffer in itself injustice, but can understand injustice, and they have solidarity with the excluded and the precariat. When I say the excluded and the precariat, you have all kinds of links with other aspects of domination that may be racial, religiousness, and so on. So it's that's the broad view I can help or I can aportar, I can give to the audience. Then our experience in Argentina is the organization of the informal sector of money. What we call, it's not the same word as informal sector, we call people's economy or grassroots economy. And we have organized a very big union in Argentina, which is one of the most mobilizing union, which is called the Union of Workers of the Popular Economy. And the struggles of this sector is linked to directly linked to the redistribution of wealth, because this sector needs what we call a social salary, which is a direct transfer from the state in order to complement what people earns in informal economy with a portion of subsidies from the state. So these subsidies have to be financed with taxes to the rich, which is one of the most immediate struggles we have, to get the rich taxed, heavily taxed. And now, and this I will end my first intervention, now we have a problem that you in the States may help a lot, which is the debt crisis. We are currently in a negotiation as a country against the most concentrated economic groups in the world. For instance, BlackRock, which wants to function like a Walter phone and to put this problem into New York justice, which will be a huge economic problem in our country. So I think we have to build the international alliances with concrete struggles. So we can here give support to your movement of Black Lives Matter and so on, with concrete issues. And we also need your help in other concrete issues.
Thank you. Gracias, Juan. Yes, of course. That's why it's important to talk now, to create bridges, as I said in the beginning of this broadcast. Now I have a question for Christian and Austin, for you both. Regarding the election, will the Trump administration obviously poor response to the COVID-19 pandemic this influence voters' decisions at the ballot boxes on November 3rd? Who wants to begin? Christian, maybe.
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah, it's hard to say because the Democrats have not exactly been responding to the pandemic in a way that's distinguishable to the Trump administration. They've definitely pointed fingers and said, wow, the Republicans aren't handling this well at all. But I don't think they've done anything courageous to show that the material interests of the working class are things that they have in mind. We know that they don't, but they haven't even necessarily made a show of it. And many view the response to COVID as separate to the response around jobs and businesses. I've noticed a pretty positive view of the administration's push to keep businesses open, which I think signals that many want to get back to work to pay their bills, but aren't interrogating why corporations got a huge bailout while we got a measly, $1,200 to sustain us for this whole time. When a stimulus check and unemployment benefits were being discussed, honestly, Bernie Sanders, who's an independent, was one of the few whose boldness actually stood out in his demands. And I think this is a huge mistake, especially in the context of the November election. There's a very small window of opportunity that's rapidly closing for the Biden campaign to embrace Medicare for all as a measure to combat the dangers of the pandemic and to ensure that healthcare is a human right available to everyone. I also think there are people who are really focusing on the fact that a lot of the decisions that are directly impacting them around COVID are actually coming from governors, and that their responses have varied across the states. Georgia's governor, I think just yesterday, banned cities and counties from any efforts to ensure that masks are required. And my own governor has prioritized reopening businesses over ensuring, the well-being of Texas residents. And I think there's a fair number of people who will blame each other for not, taking COVID seriously, for not wearing masks, for going out. And while these things don't help the situation, obviously, I think people still should be wearing masks. As socialists, I think it's crucial that we stay focused on the fact that it's a failure of the state and not of the individual, that our COVID cases are rapidly climbing day by day. And so we really need to keep the rage focused there if we have any hopes of really using this moment to politicize the masses and make sure that they are focused on the right opponent.
Yeah, sure. Austin, what can you tell us?
Sure. First, I think Christian makes a lot of good points there, especially with the Democratic Party's messaging as it's related to COVID. For example, in my state, I have a Democratic governor, right? And it was a big deal when he got elected, and it was a big deal when my state flipped its local control from Republican to Democrat. And yet he has been fully involved in trying to open up to businesses and not taking the pandemic too seriously. And it's been an issue across the board in the United States. Now, luckily in Virginia, things have been a little bit better than it has in other states. But it's just another example of the Democratic Party just missing this opportunity to actually fight for people, right? And I certainly wish it was Bernie Sanders I was voting for in November, but unfortunately, the Democratic Party went in a different direction, right? But I think broadly speaking, there's a lot to unpack with this question. So I'll do my best to be a little bit brief here. I do think ultimately, in my opinion, the answer is yes. As far as I do think the Trump administration's poor response to COVID will influence voters' decisions, generally speaking. With that said, and following up on some of the points that Christian made, I think it's also important to acknowledge that Donald Trump's base, it's almost like a cult at this point, a cult of personality for a lot of people. A lot of them, they do not care what he thinks or does, or what he says or does. They will stick with him no matter what. So I see a lot of people, or I should say, I see some people saying that they think this election could be a landslide against Donald Trump, right? Because of how bad things have gone. I don't think that will happen, personally. With that said, cannot a president deal with this much of a catastrophe and still get reelected? That's my personal opinion. Not saying it isn't possible, but if I myself had to pick right now, I'd say Joe Biden, who we all know Joe Biden's got a significant amount of baggage. I'd say Joe Biden would defeat Donald Trump for those reasons, but that it'll be close. I do not expect it to be big one way or the other. It'll still be close. And I think talking about COVID and the election, we've also got to be asking ourselves, what does the pandemic even make this election look like, right? Donald Trump would love nothing more than to rig this election more than they already will be doing, of course, through voter suppression against Black and brown people throughout the United States. I guarantee more voting stations are going to be closed strategically, right? Obviously, with the pandemic, polling stations should be, handled responsibly, but that won't happen. They'll be closed strategically. They'll look at the polling places where there's a large Black or brown population, and it's those polling places which will be closed. That I can almost guarantee. That happens every year, honestly. And I guarantee that Trump will play every trick in the book to remain in power and will utilize this pandemic as the excuse that he needs to do so. So I think, to me, when I think about the election in November, the biggest wild card that makes it hard for me to say with absolute certainty what Donald Trump's chances are is, how is the election going to look? Will dare I say it? Will there even be an election? If it is delayed or strictly mail-in voting, right? But those are my general thoughts on that.
Thank you. Yeah, for everybody, I think, I don't know, maybe Juan do not agree with me. The first, our hope was to have Bernie in the ballots. Anyway, well, so Juan, let me ask you, how do you see the North American election from the South, the consequences of this election for our countries?
We have this paradox in Latin America that sometimes the Republican approach as being more maybe self-centered and nationalistic, if you want to say, is less harmful to South America. Sometimes the Democratic, like in the neoliberal 90s, were very harmful to South America. So we have this little paradox. We don't know what to expect from Biden. We love Bernie Sanders. We think that he represents, is one of the leaders that represents in the best way the core ideas of a humanistic revolution, along with Pope Francis and some other international leaders that are saying with courage what the elites don't want to hear and what we need. And they are saying that being in an important position, because it's easier to say it from the grassroots, but when you have some power to lose, things to lose. We have to value a lot this kind of international leadership, even if we don't agree with 100% of their ideas. So our view on this is paradoxical. We don't know what to think. We see that Trump is something very similar to a fascist. We see that he puts the world in a very strange position of empowering extreme right leaderships. We see that he's a bad influence for the whole world, but we don't know what to expect from the other countries. So that's my view.
Thank you, Juan. Yes, it's really paradoxical. And we have Bolsonaro and Trump here in this continent. So, well, maybe a conclusion for each one of you. If you want to, for closing this broadcast, if you want to finish with something, let's start with Christian.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to everybody here, for making the time to have these types of conversations. I think, part of our efforts in DSA as a membership-based organization is to bring ordinary people into feeling that sense of empowerment that they are the agents of change, that they can go organize their workplaces, that we deserve democracy, not just in this in elections every 4 years, but really in democracy in our workplaces, democracy in our local governments, and as we relate to each other. And so I think that I'm always excited by the movement and the spark of the Socialist Project to get people really thinking about ways to transform their relationships to each other and to the institutions that they deal with on an everyday basis. And I think that, it's a really hard moment, right? We had a lot of energy and hope starting off the year. It's hard to believe that in March I was out, around people campaigning for Bernie. And Bernie came really close in Texas. And I think especially seeing the way Latinos in the US really drove a lot of his victories in Texas, but also especially in California and Nevada. And that was beautiful to see. It was wonderful to not be erased by this prevailing narrative that only white leftists support Bernie, but, me knowing, my dad's from Guanajuato, his ardent support for Bernie, our entire family was for Bernie. And so going from such a high of that to, a couple weeks later, COVID and the way the pandemic has really shifted the way that we organize and that we're able to, you can't just go up to talk to people anymore. You're doing a lot of things virtually. And then also just sort of the meeting the moment of the uprising. I think there's a lot of collective grief and a lot of collective mourning that we have to do. And it's hard to see that. A lot of my work has been around policing, especially around immigration with ICE in particular. And so it's really hard to see the way that, the US upholds prisons and detention centers and policing as sort of this holy structure. So, it sort of feels like hits after hits and, then kind of facing the reality of a lackluster Biden campaign, and how we know that it doesn't seem like Democrats really want to win because really, the ruling class is comfortable regardless of what power shift occurs every 4 years. And so I think for us, we definitely are feeling the urgency of the moment, but I think, we're still seeing really beautiful moments of people coming together both organically and intentionally, and really, really being willing to disrupt the systems because, to everybody's points earlier, we're really starting to see the world with with new eyes. We're really starting to break down a lot of the barriers that we hadn't before. So I do think that this moment presents an opportunity that we'd be foolish not to seize, that we'd be foolish not to, really develop relationships, particularly international relationships, because I think that's what it's going to take, is going to take an international working class movement to really dismantle capitalism. And, I think that this is the start. It starts with a conversation. So, grateful to all of you for sharing your thoughts and for being here today.
Thank you very, very much, Christian. Of course, we are seeing the world with different eyes, as you said, of course. Austin, what can you say for a conclusion?
Sure. Once again, just wanted to thank you. Thank our friends in Morena, our friends at the Institute, as well as our friends from Argentina. I think this conversation that we're having is so important. I think the socialist project in the United States is directly related to the socialist project in Mexico, the socialist project in Argentina, the socialist project throughout the Americas, throughout the world, right? Especially since we're living in this globalized world. And I would love to be able to follow up on conversations like this and continue to have dialogue among our different regions, our different movements. I think I would love even having a deep dive on what's going on in Mexico, a deep dive on what's going on in Argentina or any country throughout the Americas. I think it's so important, especially, being, like Christian and myself are, being socialists in the United States. I think it's important to build those solidarity links since we're in the belly of the beast, right? It broke my heart to see what the OAS did last year in Bolivia, right? The OAS, which is just based 1 hour north of me, right? Near Washington, D.C. And I think it's important for us to recognize that all these struggles, they're all regionally related, and that when we come together and organize together, that's how we can actually make change rather than being in our different circles. So once again, thank you so much for the conversation, and I hope to be able to do more of these in the future.
Of course, you are welcome always here in Morena. Juan, for a conclusion, what can you say?
First, that to try to be very close to the people that are suffering hunger and sickness during the pandemic. To be very close, not just as an individual option or solidarity, but as a political approach towards the pandemic. To be human and to be close and to feed the hungry. And the second issue is to continue organizing the grassroots and to empower people from grassroots backgrounds. Poor people, working class people. It's very important that the people that suffers the worst injustice speaks from their own experience and not just supports those who are speaking for us. And the last issue is very important for us to have comrades in the north of the world being radical with the systemic change. And I think, as being part of many international approaches and platforms, that it's important to try to translate these links into concrete actions of solidarity and support. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry again for being late.
Thank you, Juan. Yes, of course, it's important to take actions all over the world. So, well, I just want to say for finishing this broadcast, thank you, Austin. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Juan. It has been a pleasure for us to have you here. Our first experience in English, and it has been great. So now in Spanish. Gracias a los compañeros del Instituto de Formación Política que nos escucharon. Como saben, esta serie de programas de reflexiones para vivir en el encierro surgió porque necesitamos informarnos y necesitamos no detenernos. La pandemia podía detenernos y era muy fácil que, estando encerrados en nuestras casas, dejáramos de comunicarnos. Esta es la manera en que podemos continuar comunicándonos, informándonos pertinentemente y tomando acciones, como dice Juan. Pues muchas gracias, compañeros. Con esto terminamos y nos vemos muy pronto. You are welcome here. Thank you very much.